Welcome, everyone, and thanks for attending our regular Zoom meeting. Today it's a little bit different. I think for many of us attending public meetings, we get accustomed to housekeeping, the usual where fire alarm and toilets and that kind of stuff. But today we have to do something a little bit different in the sense that our housekeeping now is as a result of a racist attack we had in our last meeting, which was bombed with pornography. So you are warned that we may be attacked with pornography at this meeting. We met and we tried to think up measures to avoid such an occasion happening again. And we think we've got the right measures in place. But these things can be foolproof and not foolproof, and anything can happen. We thought it would be good to, if we should be attacked with pornography, I think the immediate action you can take is to um, silence your computer and also maybe just leave it for 3 minutes or so. I'm sure that in that time we would be able to um, identify and remove, anyone who's attacking our meeting. Well, it will take more than pornography. Well, they're trying to. It's clear that the racists are well organized, they're well financed, and because it's not the first time it's happened, it's not the only meeting it's happened to. I've we've had reports of it happening to left-wing meetings, generally trade unionist meetings, and definitely black meetings. So we know that there's a concerted attempt by the far right to disrupt our meetings. Um, but we won't let that happen. We won't be put off by it, and we hope that you will not be put off by them trying to disrupt our activities to try and have fighting for a better society. So we trust you will stay with us, and we're really pleased that you've joined us at this meeting. Now, we need to be reminded that no one is born a racist and that racism is a learned behavior. It is irrational behavior. These same racists attacking us with pornography and attempting to burn hotels housing migrants and refugees and claim that they are protecting their women and children. Yet over 40% of those arrested after the Stockport attack had prior convictions for domestic violence and other offenses including pedophilia. Their leaders are openly misogynist and racist. We urge those intent on disrupting our meetings to notice that they are being used by anti-working class billionaires who do not have their interests at heart. You should instead join us in the fight for a just, equal, and anti-racist society. For all and first-time members, we remind you that we are not a funded organization and depend entirely on your membership, affiliations, and donations for our activities. Please join us if you haven't by visiting our website. Today we have two extraordinary activists speaking on the desperate situation facing our region by a man who seemingly has lost his moral compass. He has been pressuring Grenada to comply with his plan to attack a friendly neighbor, Venezuela. We'll be updated on this divide and rule strategy from seasoned campaigner Chester Humphrey, who is based in Grenada. We contrast what is happening in Grenada with, on the other hand, we have Kamala Prasad, the PM of Trinidad and Tobago, gleefully cheerleading the Americans, despite at least two of our citizens being murdered at sea by the Orange Man in the White House. We'll also hear from Dr. Francisco Dominguez, who will update us on the USA attempts at getting their hands on Venezuelan oil. Before we go to our main speakers, we'd like to invite one of our executive members in Jamaica, Paul Ward, to give us a
Mm.
first-hand impression of what is happening, what has been happening with the fall of Melissa on that beautiful island. Thank you, Paul, if you want to take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Luke, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I live on the northeast of the island. I've seen the hurricane damage only on the television pictures. Around where I am, it was fallen trees across the road and a few roofs, but nothing much more. Some of you may have seen a lot more during the hurricane. We still have no electricity, and often we lost into connectivity. So a lot of you may have seen a lot more than we have. But I'm sure you've noticed that these 185-mile-an-hour hurricane that hit the southeast coast, Black River, Sablomar, that area, caused the sort of devastation that nobody could even contemplate. I don't like to make the comparison because, of course, Gaza is a different situation, but it looks like Gaza, obviously without the murder and the killings. But it's Black River especially completely flattened. People, well, the death toll is about 28 right now, but a lot of communities are cut off. People, officials traveling by helicopter a lot of the time. And so those who've seen the images, I'd also suggest you try and access the daily newspapers in Jamaica, because reading them this morning, the heartrending stories of people who didn't make it, or their families describing it, are somehow even harder hitting than the images. So the Daily Gleaner is online. You may be able to access the articles. Moving forward, the editorial in the Gleaner newspaper this morning, encouraging the government to relax the fiscal rules that we've had. We still devoted an enormous amount of money the last 10, 15 years to paying down debt. Of course, all that will now be a bit in question now. But the Gleaner article suggesting that's relaxed, and we already have the debt down to a decent figure. So devote more money than you might have thought of to the government to help the rebuilding. Black River itself just needs, for those who know a little of the history of Jamaica, the 1907 earthquake that flattened Kingston, and it was rebuilt in a much more thought out way. So whether the same might happen to Black River. One thing I would actually say, another article in the newspaper by the leader of the opposition, Mark Golding, the PNP, a bit worrying. He says that various disaster committees have been formed, but the opposition has been invited to join none of them. So it's a little of a worrying trend. Let's hope that changes, because for me, there's been various people suggesting all kinds of technocratic ways forward, and quite rightly, we need them. But again, those who know a little bit of Jamaica, in 1972-73, after the PNP got elected, and I'm not making a party point in saying that, the Jamal, the literacy campaign, united everybody across Jamaica. People from all walks of life were just helping each other to learn to read and write. After hurricanes, as you'd imagine, people do pull together, but of course, it's often a 9-day wonder. And a good friend of mine is using the word predatory behavior, and really worrying that after about 2 weeks, that thing will kick in. People will be looking to make money out of this thing, as we know happens with disasters, and the whole thing will go off center, which will be a great pity. It's a chance for Jamaica to get together, to be honest. And I hope it does. In terms of what people can do, to be honest with you, I would suggest that if you have connections in Jamaica, keep sending them money. They may not be able to get hold of that money for a little while, because even around where I am, with less destruction, none of the banking machines are working. So the shops that still have stuff in them, people can't buy it very often because they have no access to the cash, and the cards are not working. So I would encourage people to actually send their relatives money, or people, there's enough international aid organizations already on their way. So the big time efforts are, I think, already underway. So I think if you have contacts with people you can send money to, when they can get hold of it, it will be very useful. So, as I said, it's a game changer for Jamaica. It really is. Just nobody could imagine the damage that was done. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for that moving report, Paul. Our sympathies are with the family and people of Jamaica. We will be having our executive meeting soon, and I'm sure we'll be able to think about where we can direct sending some small funds that we can manage to help in that situation. So maybe you can direct us at that meeting where we might direct that support. You know, as some commentator pointed out, you know, we're suffering the worst effects of global warming, although we've contributed the least to it. And it's time the rich countries step up and pay the fair share, especially with all of the promises they make at every COP meeting, seem to fulfill them.
Actually, on that link, if I can just chip in, there's again a good letter suggesting that you know, CARICOM has got to make a lot more noise about global warming. Andrew Holness, our Prime Minister in Jamaica, is currently chair of CARICOM, and the letter suggesting that, you know, it really has to become a loud noise from CARICOM to get something actually moving on it. So let's hope that could happen.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think we did push back a meeting on climate change, and maybe our next public meeting can start to address that question, and we'll start to think about speakers. Okay, thank you very much. There's a lot of comments going in the chat. Now I will call on Francisco to take the floor. We know the situation in the Caribbean is far from ideal, with the biggest warship in the world invading our waters, and apparently at least one nation being very friendly to that warship. But I'll leave you, Francisco, to come in and tell us about what's the situation at the moment in the Caribbean.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much again. And, you know, can I thank and congratulate CLS for the vigorous activity they have carried out regarding the situation in Venezuela, which is, in my view, exemplary. So thank you so much. I think, given the latest developments, you know, we're talking about the last 48 hours, my sense is that this is only my view. I think an attack on Venezuela by the United States seems to be imminent. Everything is designed and deployed and organized in such a way to launch several strikes at the same time from various angles, which I'll come on to in a minute. The first information was that they had deployed 5,000 Marines. Later on, they increased that to 10,000. This is the official information. And then they added to that 6,000 more. So overall, it's 16,000. Given the level of mobilization, which is very expensive every day, in a country that doesn't have a lot of money for these sort of things, I think they're underestimating deliberately, not telling us the truth in terms of the numbers of soldiers deployed in all the military paraphernalia that they have deployed in the Caribbean. The fact that they feel very willing to strike who they know to be innocent people deliberately in order to send those informations and those images back home to sort of demonstrate that they are doing something very serious about, you know, drug trafficking. So far, they carried out another attack yesterday. And so far, I think between 11 and 12 boats have been blown out of the water by lethal strikes. where these boats literally disappear with one exception, which I'll come on to. And so far, according to the information from various sources, such as Venezuela itself, the United States, and so on, the number of people that have been killed is 62. Not everybody is Venezuelan. In fact, very likely, many of them are not Venezuelan. We know at least of 2 who happen to be Trinidadian. You know, it appeared in the first front page of the Guardian in Trinidad. So clearly they are determined to really strike very hard. I'm not sure whether I can share the screen, because there was an article in the Washington Post, I think yesterday, where it shows you graphically the number of warships, submarines, bombers, and all the rest of it that deployed to actually do this, you know, combat against narco trafficking or drug trafficking in the Caribbean. Let me see if I try. If I don't succeed, I'll continue with my talk. I don't think I'm going to.
I think Steve will probably take a little time to.
No, I don't think I'm going to be able to. But what it is, let me tell you, this is called, they call the one that is very terrifying, I suppose, for any small nation, and certainly Venezuela, which is not small, is the USS Gerald Ford, which is the biggest aircraft in the planet. It's the largest. It's the, I don't know what capacity it has in terms of soldiers, it might be a few thousands. And it has a capacity to carry between 79 to 90 war planes, which can be deployed anywhere. And these planes, war planes, are F-35, which is the latest in terms of their technology. They used to have F-16 as the best of it, and they've been selling them off to everybody else. So having that deployed, you know, there is a clear indication that they mean serious business. Then they have destroyers. Then they have warships equipped with missiles. One of them apparently is able to fire 1,200 missiles in one single go. They are medium range. They're not nuclear, but they are powerful and medium range. That is to say, I think I made this point before, if that plane, if that boat happens to be around the Panama Canal, it can reach anybody in any direction. They have about 12 destroyers, very fast planes, such as there is this one which is called B-1B Lancer, which is a supersonic bomber, which goes at an extraordinary velocity, speed. Then there is B-52, which are the ones the United States used to bombing. Then other warplanes, which are called Poseidon, Osprey, F-35, AB-8B, Harriet II, MQ-9, Reaper, helicopters, and so on, and including a nuclear submarine. There is more, but that'll give you an idea of, you know, the complications we have with the actual size of what Venezuela is facing. What is interesting is this: there was one strike against one. It was not a boat. This was a real drug trafficking thing. You know, these drug traffickers produce small submarines. They're called homemade, but they have high technology to produce them. And the reason why they use submarines, which can carry several tons of drugs, is because they go underwater that cannot be detected that easily. And the Colombians specialize in this. They struck one of those, And there were 2 survivors. And the 2 survivors were rescued by another warship of the United States itself. They were taken to the United States. One of them is a Colombian, and the other one is Ecuadorian. And what is interesting is that the government of the United States, despite the fact that it's persecuting these drug traffickers and so on, decided to release them without any charges and send them back to their own countries. One of them, according to the Venezuelan television, Venezuelan information, is an actual drug trafficker who is being convicted before, not once, several times, the Ecuadorian one. So what is going on? So clearly, the drug trafficking or the combat against drug trafficking is an excuse. Some people have argued correctly, in my view, and convincingly, the following. If these boats are carrying, the ones that have been blown up, if they're carrying drugs, why not intercept them and capture them? Arrest the people who are, doing committing the crime, take them to the United States, show the evidence of the actual seized cocaine or drugs, and then, you have the evidence. They don't do that. That's the first point. The second point is why would, now that this force is being deployed in the Caribbean, why would any drug trafficker would actually go all the way to the United States when, given their size, they will need to stop at least 18 to 20 times to refuel because they will not have enough fuel to actually reach the Florida. The one submarine was actually destroyed in the Pacific coast, which is not where the actual fleet is. And the third point which I'm making, which I think is a very good one, is saying if the United States want to stop cocaine coming into its own country, why not deploy whatever military hardware they may have in their own coastline? Why in Venezuela? Why in Grenada? Why in Trinidad and Tobago, and so on? So clearly there is more than meets the eye here. To make matters worse, the United States, the State Department, and the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, actually have been putting pressure on Caribbean countries to accept being part of launching pads, military launching pads for the United States to attack. These have been certainly in Grenada, which you are aware of. Trinidad and Tobago is enthusiastically collaborating, certainly the government is enthusiastically collaborating in the operation. And then the governor of Puerto Rico also has been very enthusiastic supporting the whole thing. So if you take a look at the geography of it, you can see the United States is really surrounding Venezuela with military hardware as far as it can, as much as it can. On top of that, the United States has a naval base in Guantanamo in Cuba, and it has military bases in Honduras. It has military bases in Panama. It has military facilities and other things in the Bahamas, and it has at least 10 military bases in Colombia. So if it were to pounce, the lethality which it could do, given the deployment of this force, would be enormous. The key, it seems to me, at this stage of the game is the following. I think the strategies of the United States, the Trump, the Pentagon, State Department, Marco Rubio is leading the whole thing, definitely, is to see whether these mounting, very threatening pressure on Venezuela is actually going to produce some sort of a split, one within the armed forces in Venezuela, and two at the level of the political leadership, which is what they want. And so far, excuse my colloquialism, I'm not very good at it, but so far, not even a sausage, nothing. The whole thing remained absolutely united, even better. When the threat began to materialize with the deployment of the fleet, the Venezuelan government actually set up 1,500 at least recruitment centers for people to join the People's Militia. The People's Militia, before the deployment of the fleet, was about 5 million people who have been trained for some time. They are part of the constitution, so it's nothing to do with paramilitarism. But now, the latest information after that recruitment effort, the militia has gone up to 8 million. Now, the government actually has distributed, armed to these people. These people already have been deployed absolutely everywhere in the country. And the result of this is, it seems to me, two political questions. Number one, Venezuela is not afraid of its people because you wouldn't give weapons to your people if they're going to attack you. So clearly, they have the support of the population, and the government trusts the population. And this is really, the population is very enthusiastic. I mean, the amount of mobilization, the fervor with which they actually appear on television saying they want to defend their nation with everything they have, even prepared to give their lives, is an indication of this. And the leadership is remained totally resolute. They're not going to give 1 inch. And they're prepared to fight when and if, God forbid, the United States attack. But because the pressure is not producing the results, then the United States decided to resort to the usual dirty tricks. One of them has been to actually send a small destroyer to Trinidad and Tobago, as part of some scheduled military joint maneuvers, that kind of thing, which the United States always uses whenever it wants to do something nasty. And then the government of Venezuela, the law and order forces discovered and arrested several mercenaries coming from Trinidad and Tobago, including CIA agents, which were leading them. And the whole idea was, because Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela are very close geographically, the plan that they were trying to hatch was to actually attack, bomb that destroyer that was docked in Trinidad and Tobago, and then blame Venezuela for attacking it. And then that would be the casus belli to actually go for it. So that gives you an idea of, they're beginning to get desperate. So that's the first thing that, I want to make sure that people are aware of this monumental dimension. It's really, really big. I don't think there has been such a level of military deployment by the United States with a threatening manner in Latin America in the last, I don't know how many years. Possibly the biggest one before was in 1989 when they overthrew and they invaded Panama, which is, several decades ago. So, in other words, this is very serious. I'll come back to, what they want to do if I have the time later on. Just to lay to rest this false accusation that Venezuela is an narco state. I think I made this point, but it's worth repeating in case there is somebody new in the meeting that haven't heard these arguments, because it's important to dismantle it. Venezuela is not a narco state. It's far from it. In fact, the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, which produces an annual report, which is the most reliable information on drug trafficking and crime in the world, is one of the best things. It produces a report usually of about 300 pages that people like me read in detail. And they give you so much detail, the amount of cultivation, where it is located, how much goes where, the routes they use, the amount of cocaine and so forth, which is incredible. So they say that between 87% and 92% of the cocaine produced, mainly in Colombia, secondarily in Ecuador, and partly in Peru, gets to the United States via the Pacific. Not And Venezuela doesn't have a coastline in the Pacific at all. And about 5%, this is their information, the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, 5% tries to make it through Venezuela, but not all of it does. In other words, drug traffickers try to use illegally Venezuela as a transit route, but they don't succeed because according to the official information from the Venezuelan government, they're able to actually capture about 70% of what they try to take through there. So in other words, Venezuela doesn't. Even better, this same office of the United Nations reckons that Venezuela does not have laboratories to produce cocaine, none, and there is no illegal cultivation in Venezuelan soil at all, and they've been certified Venezuela with these things for the last easily 10 to 15 years, if not longer. Now, the US government says that Venezuela is a narco-state run by something called Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, would be the translation. This cartel does not exist. If you read the report from the Drug Enforcement Administration the last 30 years, if you want to, and from the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, again, go through the last 30 years, nobody mentioned the Cartel de los Soles. It doesn't exist. It's just an invention. Even better, when the government of Venezuela, or the government of the United States said, well, yeah, but the Cartel de los Soles has a connection with the Cartel of Sinaloa, which is a real cartel that exists in Mexico. And the president of Mexico immediately said, this is not true because our intelligence as government indicates there is no connection between the Cartel of Sinaloa and the Venezuelan government or Venezuelans at all. So this is, completely false. And it's interesting that in the latest developments that have taken place now with the threats, the mainstream media actually have come out exactly with these figures in sort of ways. I've seen Al Jazeera, I've seen even the BBC putting down on these accusations and allegations for the first time in some time. In other words, the Europeans and others are getting a bit nervous about it. So the United States typically, and Trump, I would say more particularly, is actually what is done, faced with these complications, has doubled down on the pressure. So what he's done, he's decided to accuse Colombia also being a narco state, which is, typical of Trump. Then he accused Petro of being the head of the mafioso, head of a cartel, producing cocaine and shipping it to the United States, which is totally false. Even went as far as to suggest regime change in Colombia, which made President Maduro to make a public statement saying, don't worry, comrade, or something to that effect. If the United States is coming for you, we will be there to support you with everything we have. And so that's a very interesting, and President Petro welcomed that support. Both governments actually have deployed at least each side 25,000 soldiers in the common border to ensure there is no shenanigans and no monkey business taking place from anybody, the paramilitaries, the narco traffickers, and so on from the Colombian side in this particular situation. Then Trump continued to double down, of course, because when he's caught, he moves somewhere else and launches another accusation. She accused Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, that she was led by drug cartels in Mexico, which is a completely ridiculous thing. And then overall, Trump himself and the Trump government, Trump cabinet have suggested that what they need to do is to transform the maritime war against drug trafficking into a land one by identifying land targets within these countries, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela, to attack militarily, which is extremely serious. I think the intention is to ensure that they have a sort of media context for them to launch attacks on land in Venezuela, which is extremely worrying, of course. Now, the Venezuelan defenses, which I think is important to say, have been massively boosted. Venezuela is very well equipped. I only know the information which is public. So what I'm going to tell you is public. There is nothing secret. I don't know any secret. I don't want to know any secret of that kind. They have the best fleet of warplanes, Sukhoi warplanes, which are Russians, which are #1, perhaps even than the F-35. In terms of Latin America, proportionally, Venezuela is extremely well armed. Venezuela has its own plant to manufacture Kalashnikov weapons because they got a license which was requested by President Chavez at the time when Chavez wanted to renew the military equipment of his armed forces, and the United States refused to sell them, so he went to Russia. And then, it's producing, I don't know, at the time it must have got easily 200,000, and then it's been producing them ever since. Then 3 days ago, I think it's 3 days ago, there was Russia sent to Venezuela 5,000 special missiles, which are anti-aircraft, which is 5,000, and they are being deployed already. And President Maduro and the Venezuelan government is trying to show this as much as possible publicly. And I think the reason behind this is they think that President Trump, who is not very clever and is not very informed and is not very educated, to be very polite about it, is being manipulated by his entourage, particularly Marco Rubio, that he's being persuaded that, the Venezuelan government is all over the place, is terrible, he's on the floor, the population doesn't support him, he hasn't got modern military equipment, and they're resistant. If anything, it's going to take a few hours, which is obviously not only false, but it's faulty intelligence, which he's been fed, and that's why he's saying the thing he's saying. So Venezuela is determined to ensure, I understand it's using third parties, suppose that governments will be the correct phrase, to ensure that President Trump knows the hardware military capacity of Venezuela, so he thinks twice about it, which brings me to the question of Venezuela's political strategy to deal with this. It's two-track. Number one is obviously to prepare Venezuela with everything they have to defend themselves to the death. And one former foreign minister, encapsulated this sentiment very nicely indeed, with something which sounded really powerful. He said, "You young, U.S. soldier, if you are coming here prepared to kill, be prepared to die, because we're going to defend ourselves with everything we have. Our land is sacrosanct. Nobody will soil it, and certainly will not let you to do it." So what we have now is things are getting interesting in the sense that Venezuela's diplomacy is quite skillful. Most people do not notice because the media, all it does is demonizes and lies about Venezuela, but actually they're very skillful. They've been able to force several discussions in the Security Council of the United Nations in order to, denounce this aggression against them, which is against the United Nations Charter. That's number one. Now, these discussions actually produce significant allies in the discussions. I think the position of the UK government in those discussions was absolutely terrible. They fell short of calling for invasion, but everything else more or less justified it. But what do you expect? The Europeans are like that. The important thing is Venezuela is trying to actually enlist as many international forces as possible, such as CELAC, the Commonwealth of Latin American and Caribbean nations. 21 nations actually issued very strong statements. The non-aligned movement, the G77 plus China, which also, issue a statement and, express solidarity support for Venezuela. Then there is the ALBA countries, and then they got what they call the Greater Caribbean of parliamentarians. And Venezuela is moving everything it has or everything it can internationally to ensure that it isolates the United States. And this has a very important purpose, which I think is very intelligent. It's one of the things that might work. The pressure within the United States against this is growing massively. I'm not saying that the population are in the street doing it. This is not the case. But at the level of parliamentarians, the Democrats, not that I trust them 1 inch, because they've been guilty of doing similar things in the past. But they're very unhappy about this operation. There is a little bit of a crisis within the Pentagon because the commander-in-chief of the Southern Command, who is in charge of the South Caribbean Sea, resigned when he learned about this operation and the blowing up of boats. And then there have been a couple of generals which are less significant but also important in terms of the crisis, also resigned because they don't agree with it. The key Democrats are actually they've tried in the Senate, they're trying to pass at least 2 resolutions to try to prevent Trump from conducting this war against Venezuela and conducting this operation, which is doing a huge damage to the credibility and the image of the United States and destroying alliances internationally in every possible way, which is what they're really worried about. One of them, Senator Schiffer, who is quite important, I think in terms of the Democratic Party, will be number 3, because you have Schumer, which is the leading leader of the Democrats in the Senate. You have Hakeem Jeffries, who is the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, and then you have Schiffer, which is number 2 in the Senate. So he issued a postcard, opposing it completely and saying this is not right. Even Hillary Clinton went public on an interview saying that what was going on with the killing of these people was extrajudicial killings that were not complete, were not justified at all, and they were a crime against humanity. Which, is interesting that she said it, because she's a warmonger, always has been. Nevertheless, the main concern, in my view, is that they're not sure that a military adventure in attacking Venezuela is going to work. Doesn't mean to say it's not going to cause damage, doesn't mean to say that it's not going to cause destruction and so on, which it will, but they won't be able to actually do what they want, in whichever form they want to do it. And it's very likely if they go in, they'll get stuck and they will become a quagmire. And if it lasts the resistance 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and so on, with complications with the world, going up in arms, particularly Latin America, you can imagine how nervous the Brazilians are, how nervous everybody else is, how nervous the Mexicans would be, and so on. So they would say, no, this is not right. And then what do? They will be very difficult. But the worst part of it, from the point of view of these Democrats I'm talking about, is that if it fails, which is likely to, then the Venezuelans will be totally justified in bringing international forces to sustain them later on after the thing fails significantly, particularly the Russians, but not exclusively. And their arguments, I'm not sure what this is going to happen. It might do, it might not do, but this is what they think. So therefore, their consideration is once they get in here, then, our hemisphere will stop being our hemisphere. It will be an international hemisphere. And then it will be fair game for anybody to join any international thing, which will destroy totally the Monroe Doctrine. They will not be able to put pressure on anybody, except very few, with very insignificant results, particularly if countries and governments in the region realize they can stand up to the United States because there will be powerful allies that may come to the rescue and will be in the vicinity. And this is what they're worried about. They've been trying to, persuade governments, overthrow governments and so on, to break with China and to break with Russia in the region. That's the strategy of the Democrats so far. But this will bring things to a head. So let me finish with this. My worry is precisely this possible failure and, certain isolation, political isolation of the United States, of the Trump government rather, on this military adventure, which is this. What do they do if it fails, I mean, imagine if they were to fold it and say, okay, we've done the job, and then go back home empty-handed. Anybody's going to say, what the hell was that for? What do you think you were doing? You know, just killing fisher people who were fishers, you know, fishermen, and for no purpose. And how much cocaine did you actually capture? How much did you seize? You know, where is it? Where is the beef? There is nothing. So the Democrats now are doing extremely well in the polls, and Trump is doing very badly in the polls. Exactly the opposite. There will be 3 elections in the 4th of November in 2 days. And it will be in New Jersey, and it will be in New York, and there is another one which I forget where it is, in Virginia. And all 3 of them, something significant may happen from the political point of view against Trump. In New York, somebody called Sora Mamdani is very likely to win, and he's a socialist Democrat, which is, you know, sort of new breed. It's very interesting. And he's really shaking up the Democratic Party in all sorts of ways because he proposes something quite significant. I don't have time to go into the details. Nevertheless, this is something that it might produce significant results. It's being supported by Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. Not that these people are revolutionary, they are not, but certainly they are against imperialistic operations by the United States, largely, not completely, which is good enough considering the situation Venezuela faces. So, and in Virginia, there is a Republican governor and there is a Democratic candidate which is likely to win. In other words, they will flip the state in favor of the Democrats. And in New Jersey, they look the same. There is a Republican governor and they look like the Democrats are going to flip it to their side, which will prepare the ground for the next year for them to recover the Congress and the Senate. So this is creating a very difficult situation for this deployment of the war fleet, because if they go back with a failure, with empty-handed, you know, people in the United States and the Democrats are going to really go for a carnage, which if I were Democrats, I would do. So that's the thing. So the incentive therefore for them to do something quite dramatic is very great. And that's my worry. At any rate, what we need to do is continue to do exactly what we're doing, you know, increasing pressure, organizing pickets, and doing everything we're doing. And for your information, there is going to be a very important event on the 15th of November in Bolivar Hall. So I can send the information. It will be, it's been organized by the embassy and others, and we are part of it in that sense. It's not organized completely by us, but we are going to have play a central role in this. And it's very important that, you know, this prepares the ground for the battles that are coming, because this is not going to be the end. God knows what the United States will do next, especially now that it's facing, which I believe is a terminal crisis of imperialism, certainly of US imperialism, and they haven't got any possibility, whatever they do, to actually recover. So, viva Venezuela, viva Latin America, and let me finish with this. Trump, take your dirty hands off Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for that very comprehensive sweep of the Caribbean and the issues and what is likely to unfold. There are a couple of questions that I think is really important, because with these attacks, our sovereignty, you know, will be challenged or compromised very deeply. And some people are thinking the Caribbean islands need to form a stronger political union, as was envisaged some time ago, with a federation. And I'm hearing it from numerous places now that, you know, we need to be talking about federation again. It's something we look at that on our executive. The other thing that is pretty worrying is that we've maintained a zone of peace for generations now in the Caribbean region, and it being threatened in this way is very worrying for many citizens. I know you haven't mentioned Guyana in your talk as one of the countries that is actually probably supportive of the American action in the region. From my understanding, there are probably some troops on the ground. I'm worried that Guyana could be dragged into this war and what the effects would be on Guyanese citizens. So we are opposed to NCLS to what is happening in terms of the American aggression against Venezuela. I wonder if you can elaborate on anything that you know about the situation of Guyana, of troops in Guyana, of American troops in Guyana, and how that violates the zone of peace agreement, as far as I understand it. We know Trinidad has clearly taken a position and have decided that they will entertain the Americans. And I should say that here, the Trinidad government, because I think most of the population are probably against this move. And some of you would have heard the most amazing calypso that was just recently released as a result of Kamala's support for the Americans. So yes, Guyana and sovereignty and
Sure.
zone of peace.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government of Guyana made the strategic mistake for the country's sovereignty, which is to allow the United States to militarize the territorial dispute that exists between Venezuela and Guyana. And to allow the militarization of that meant that they were, in the circumstances, led into an agreement with Exxon Oil, by which Exxon, from the Venezuelan point of view, is stealing their oil, which belongs to them, but they don't want to do anything about it because they want this dispute to be settled peacefully as a result of negotiations on the basis of the Geneva Agreement of 1966, which, is one page. We can find it. It's very simple. It said governments should negotiate. They should never, under any circumstances, that's what the agreement says, should resort to violence or force, which Venezuela hasn't done. By allowing the militarization of it, on the one hand, the United States, allow itself to have access to significant supplies of oil, certainly for this company Exxon. But the contract that Irfan and Exxon signed leaves something like 15%, if not less, of the profits. In Guyana, 85% goes to Exxon. If there had been, and Chavez actually discussed this in the past, if there had been an agreement between the two of them, Chavez always insisted that, the profitability of the rich soil or subsoil that they have should be shared between the two countries. And I think any agreement between Venezuela and Guyana under those circumstances in the Geneva Agreement would be much more profitable and much more beneficial to the people of Guyana and to Guyana as a country than it is now. The worst mistake is now the United States will not leave. They have held several military maneuvers, joint military maneuvers. Guyana's military, with the support, I imagine, and encouragement of the United States, has engaged in several provocations against Venezuela, accusing them of attacking Guyana, and some of which Venezuela has no intention. So I wouldn't be surprised, and I'm not going to be surprised if I learn, which I think I will do at some point, that the United States also has deployed stuff and is ready to use it against Venezuela from Guyanese territory. If Irfan says that he believes is peace, the Caribbean is a zone of peace, and there is a fixed, firm commitment to that. The trouble is not credible because he's lied before several times, particularly regarding all sorts of other things. Given that now he is a political and economic prisoner of the United States, in a sort of figurative sense, when and if the United States give the order, you can imagine what he's are likely to do. I think it's very unlikely if that were to happen. I hope it doesn't. If that were to happen, that Irfan is going to say, excuse me, I'm not prepared to accept this. Get out of my country, take your troops and your military hardware. We're going to, affirm our sovereignty. I doubt it very much. Because he decided to accept and agree to the United States being his key ally. So therefore, that is there. And this brings me to a small but important point, which is the United States is doing this not because of any human rights that has disappeared from their narrative, for democracy that has disappeared from their narrative as well. It's all about drug trafficking, and I think is really behind that is the largest reserve of oil in the planet that the United States is desperate to get their filthy hands on. And that applies to the Republicans, Trump, and also Biden in the past, and Obama included. So, it's sort of random. Imagine Venezuela has 30 million inhabitants. It's got very powerful military capacity. Guyana has got 800,000 inhabitants. It's very small. Most of the people are concentrated in one city, 90-something%. There is no much. Venezuela doesn't want to do that. It doesn't want. I mean, again and again and again, they're insisted. And when there was the last complication, some 3 years ago, I think in 2023, Venezuela resorted to the Latin Americans to actually bring a meeting of all parties involved, particularly Guyana and Venezuela, where they were under Lula's initiative, which was, Maduro who insisted on this. And they agreed to actually confirm that they would not use military force to settle the settlement, and they committed themselves to continue meeting regularly in terms of continue discussion to sort it out. But then Guyana has abandoned these conversations unilaterally. So that gives you an idea of where things are going. Let's hope that his statement that he believes the Caribbean is a zone of peace, and he, has expressed a firm commitment to this. I hope it's true. If it's true, excellent. But otherwise, I will remain skeptical.
Good. Thanks, Francisco. We've got a few questions, a few hands up. But before we do, I hope you can stick around for a while, because I've just got a message coming through that unfortunately our next scheduled speaker will not be able to appear because of a death in his family. So
I can speak on Venezuela for days, so sorry.
So
I gave away.
Our condolences to Chester, and we will be in touch with him.
Sure.
Now we know that Joseph is down there we've got Joseph in Grenada, and I think he's probably able to give some report of maybe the outcome of, or if there's going to be some discussion in Parliament about the decision about allowing Americans to use the airport to attack Venezuela. So I'll bring in Joseph at this point, and then Stephen will hear your question. Joseph, you want to take the floor?
Yeah, thank you very much, Luke, and let me publicly express my condolence to Comrade Chester Humphrey on the death of a family member. I wanted to ask before I talk about Grenada, wanted to ask Francisco if the 15th, the activity on the 15th, if it is part of that Worldwide International Day of Resistance, which will have a major demonstration in Belém, in Brazil.
No.
I just wanted to ask him.
No, it's a different. Sorry, can I answer that one? No, it's an initiative by several groups that are in solidarity with Venezuela that emerged from various parts, and they thought that we being the biggest one, and being around for 20 years doing solidarity work with Venezuela, we should play a central role. So we agreed to do it. And I think very likely the ambassador is going to speak at that one. So it's got no connection with Brazil, with the Brazilian thing.
Okay, but
Thanks. So, sorry,
day of
Joseph. Yeah. Okay, go on, Joseph.
the Day of International Resistance is expected to have demonstrations throughout the world, but the biggest one would be in Brazil, in Belém. Now, to answer
Okay.
yeah.
Thanks. Just if I can just interject for a minute, the meeting that you're speaking of, Francisco, I know it's in London. I know many of the people on this meeting are not living in London. I will have to make my apologies. I'm actually speaking on the day on reparations in Bristol, so I won't be able to attend that meeting. So my apologies for that one.
We'll miss
Okay,
you.
Joseph, you can go back. Yeah.
Yeah, as for the situation in Grenada, in fact, the meeting in Parliament was aborted. I think the opposition objected that they got information for that discussion very late. So my information is that they will meet on Tuesday coming to deal with it. There's a lot of debate in Grenada still about whether the government has been kind of, I would say, not given enough information, or bearing in mind the request came since in August. But I think if there's anything, more Grenadians are more clear because of what the conversation that was generated. They had Ruggles Ferguson, that the Queen's Counsel, and Siddiqui Sylvester, the last two people that was on radio and television, dealing with the matter a lot from an international law point of view, clarifying that even if the Americans had some justification, it is what they're doing is against international law. So I think people are anxious to get this thing over, but not realizing that, I mean, it's very, very difficult for the government in terms of some of the things that tie them in, ship riders agreement, the fact that the United States recently put some restriction on the fishing industry and all the stuff, sanction one of the ministers, and so all of these things kind of get people a little on edge. But I think it is true to say that more people across the divide understand better the issues that are at stake. Interestingly enough, people are being criticizing the opposition for the almost absolute silence. I think that is all I would say for now.
All right, thanks. Is there any mobilization of people to protest this, probably U.S. cooperation with the U.S.? I would imagine, if that action is taken, it will affect many people's lives.
There was a demonstration sometime last week, not this week, the week before, which was fairly attended. And in fact, one of the parliamentarians, that Peter David, came out very clear. He's an independent parliamentarian in Parliament and is about to launch a new party. Came out very clearly and says no to this, no to the installation of the radar. So things are picking up. I mean, people's disappointment though is our neighbor Trinidad in terms of the complicity in this whole thing, because we are affected because our fishermen are fighting to go to fishing. My father was a fisherman and I had two brothers who ended up in Venezuela. They drifted one time. And so it could happen anymore. Fishermen are fighting in Grenada, as in Trinidad and probably Tobago.
Thanks. Okay. Stephen, do you want to take the floor with your question?
Yes, sorry about that. I was having a problem on muting. Thank you, Comrade Chair. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Senor Francisco Dominguez, el excelente presentación, señor.
Gracias.
Condolences going out to Brother Chester Humphrey on the passing of his loved one, to he and all of the loved ones, because it's not a good experience. There are so many questions I have to ask you, but I'll just keep it to two. Guyana has something like 11 billion barrels of untapped gas, 11 billion barrels of untapped gas, and 2.4, what is it? I think it's 12.5 trillion cubic feet of gas. The first one was about oil, the 11 billion. Suriname has 2.4 billion barrels of oil that's untapped, and 12.5 trillion cubic feet of gas. People will usually mention Guyana, but they don't seem to stress what Suriname has. When you combine these three nations, Venezuela, Guyana, and Suriname's untapped oil and gas resources, that basically, I mean, there's nowhere else on the earth that you could find that kind of energy. What do you think, how do you think that plays into this pending invasion of Venezuela, which is being disguised as to send these kind of warships with helicopters and bombers and, drones and the whole bit. To do what? Take out some fishermen, which is internationally illegal and is considered murder? Can you put that into perspective, please? And I'd really like to hear the financial aspects to what you were talking about, because I think that is the bottom line for this pending invasion. Thank you, Brother Chair.
Thank you, Stephen. I don't see any questions in the chat. So if people want to put questions in the chat, I will put them to Dr. Francisco. But for now, Francisco, you want to reply to Stephen?
Yeah. Venezuela has 300 billion barrels of oil. At the present level of consumption, it will have oil for 300 years, if no longer. Now, Chavez was one that insisted so much from the very beginning. I think he began to talk about this around 2003. And the reason why it began in 2003, because that was the moment after the failed coup and after the oil lockout, which the opposition organized, the government was able to actually control the state oil company from that moment on. And therefore, Chavez was in a position to start making deals with the, Latin Americans. And his consideration was the following. He said, we should integrate as much as we can, making sure that there are compensations when somebody who joins these, he wanted to create a sort of cartel. It wasn't a cartel, but you know what I mean. A sort of consortium of state oil companies in the whole of Latin America. And he created Petrosur, oil companies, petroleum companies of the south of South America. And he proposed that to South Americans. He managed to start getting there. And then he proposed something called Petroamerica, that is to say Petroleum America, that is to say the whole of Latin America, setting up a single consortium of state oil companies to be integrated to ensure that the revenues, number one, were increased for the countries in question by nationalizing them, as Venezuela had done. Several countries did this actually. Bolivia did it right away, and so Argentina did it as well, and so on. And Ecuador did it as well. The way, just to give you an example, in the case of Ecuador, when Correa was in government, multinational companies got 80% of the profits of the oil extracted from Ecuador. And Correa reverted that, and then the Ecuadorian government got only 20%. President Correa reverted that to say, we, the country, will get 80%, and you, the company, will get 20%, and got away with it. So this was creating a sort of significant thing, and he said, what we need to do is to ensure that, number one, we don't produce in excess, because it's got two complications. Number one, to produce in excess produces a glut in the market and brings the price down. But number two, it causes enormous environmental damages. So the idea was to actually, work with the latest possible technology to ensure that everybody benefits, and the revenues of the oil, as they were used in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, and other places that nationalized them, will benefit the population. That's why they were able to bring down poverty. They were able to bring, houses for people, free education, free health, and so on. And that was his plan. And they made a deal with the Caribbean countries, and Venezuela set up PetroCaribe. PetroCaribe was Venezuelan oil, and it caused some complications with Trinidad and Tobago, not with Guyana at the time, to say, how about, this company will give you oil at preferential prices in contract that lasts 25 years of credit, which will be very low in terms of interest rates. So since the Caribbean countries, we're talking about the English Caribbean countries, particularly, not exclusively, are small in size, they have a small population, but they have enormous, energy bills. If they didn't have to worry about their energy bills by PetroCaribe, then that would be fantastic, injection of resources and subsidies, which Venezuela was undertaking. And 13 countries, as far as we know, 13, 14 countries actually took advantage of this in the Caribbean, in the English Caribbean. And the idea was to actually negotiate with Trinidad and Tobago particularly, and I think the same would have happened where Guyana started to extract his own, whatever they claim, his own oil. It would have been the same. And that was the plan. And he said that we should do the same with everything. And it was Venezuelan oil revenues that actually funded a joint health program with Cuba, which was Operation Miracle, which was one of the consequences that what could have been done. Let me tell you briefly, Chair, if I may, on this, because it's very important to know the potential of what could be done by our rich resource, our countries being rich in resources. They funded a program that identified people who were blind or very, impaired in sight because of cataracts and similar ailments. They brought them in, they flew them in from wherever they were into either Venezuela or Cuba with somebody who accompanied them free of charge. They were operated and restored their eyesight free of charge, and the convalescence, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, whatever it took, was also free of charge. And then they were flown back to their country of origin free of charge. They carry out 4 million operations, 4 million, in about 6 years, perhaps even less. And they discussed, Fidel and Chavez discussed the possibility of actually extending such a program to Africa. Can you imagine what that would have done to the world? So that was his conception. His conception, no, I want to compete because my oil is better and I want Venezuela to be stronger and to be the tough guy, the one that does it. Quite the opposite. In fact, the amount of revenues that Venezuela has spent in the first period of Chavez, from 2003 all the way to 2015-16, when things began to go sour for them, they spent so much money. And I remember this because I'm an economist, so I sort of understand some of this. I discussed with Venezuelan officials, said, why did you spend all this money, and then shouldn't that you use it to industrialize your own country? And they said, yes, we should have done it. But he said, you know, there is this social deficit in Latin America, and we wanted to give that a priority. And I said, well, you know, now you are in trouble. He said, yeah, of course we are. I said, would you do again? Would you do it again? You know, if you were to have the same position before, he said, of course we will do it again. That's our nature. So that's where Guyana fits in. Guyana doesn't want to fit in because it's, at the moment, it's a political, I want to use my word very carefully, I don't want to offend anybody. It's become an instrument of the United States that is being used not only to divide the Caribbean, but also to divide, you know, Guyana against Venezuela. So that's what it fits in. So imagine all the resources that, you know, that you, Comrade Stephen, mentioned. You know, this amount of gas, this amount of oil, this amount of things. You need to actually organize it wisely, because if you produce too much oil, the price declines, plummets. Obama, just to finish my point, Obama actually organized huge amount of fracking in the United States in 2008, 2009, deliberately to actually make the price of oil plummet in the world market. And in the United States, as a result of fracking, sometimes I want to mispronounce that word, but I won't. The amount of fracking led the United States to go on a production from 4 million barrels of oil a day to 10 million. And the consequence of that the price of oil at the time was $150 the barrel, mainly because of the war, and went down to minus, you know, less than $25. And the Venezuelan economy, you know, got in huge trouble because it was so heavily dependent on it, on its revenue. So I'm going to finish. So what Chavez was saying is, let's use all of these resources wisely so that everybody benefits. Sorry, I went on too long. I apologize.
No, it's all right. I'll bring you back to it because I wanted to question or to make the point really that, you know, Chavez did some amazing things in his short time in office for the Caribbean and for the whole region. And it's not surprising that the Americans would want to crush that example of what can be done, similar as they did with Grenada, in the short time that they were able to produce, you know, great results for the citizens. Now, the American response to Venezuela and to other countries in the region has been to sanction them. I wonder if you can say something about the effects of sanctions on Venezuela, not only on Venezuela, but the other Latin American countries that have been, and especially Cuba, 60 years of a blockade and sanctions, and what that has meant for our region. You know, Cuba, which has supported most countries in the world in terms of the health service, you know, the first to arrive when there's a disaster and the last to leave. That's how we remember them. So if you can say something about sanctions and how Venezuela's coped, was managed with, and the other region.
Cuba was able to withstand these sanctions that, you know, been there for 60 years because of the relationship it had with the Eastern European Socialist Bloc, and particularly the Soviet Union. Cuba received from the Soviet Union at the time, for about 35 years, something like 12 million tons of oil per year, which was unrefined. In order to run the Venezuelan economy, which is poor in energy resources, the Cuban economy needed 9 million. So Cuba refined the 12 million, and it got them at 20% of the world market price. Imagine, you know, we didn't have to pay 80%. And it did it in exchange for sugar. I'll come back to the sugar question in a second. So Cuba refined the 12 million, ran its economy with 9 million, and sold the other 3 million tons in the world market at the actual price. So it got a double whammy, you know, beneficially. The Soviet Union actually, in '85, say, paid the price of the pound of sugar in the world market in 1985 was about 7 cents of a dollar. The Soviet Union paid 40. deliberately in order to help. And Cuba sold something like 7 to 8 million tons of sugar every year. So imagine only these two things. That give you an idea, the United States could apply any sanctions it wanted without any complications. Cuba used those resources in order to build the biggest welfare state in the world in terms of, the amount of things that it gave to the people. Free education, free everything. Cuba is the only place, for a long time, was the only place where the daughter of a sugar cane cutter could become a doctor, a medical doctor. Only there, not by the one, by thousands, and so on. I mean, when the Soviet Union collapsed and things became very difficult, that's when it began to bite, and the United States began to increase the pressure. In the case of Venezuela, it was much worse because Venezuela did not have this big partner anywhere else. So the United States was able to actually blockade the economy in order, the intention was to asphyxiate it. And they began with Obama on the 9th of March, 2015, Obama signed Executive Order 16032, which, I remember by heart, which declared Venezuela to be an unusual and extraordinary threat to the foreign policy of the United States and the national security of the United States. Therefore, the sanctions were applied. How can Venezuela be such an unusual and extraordinary threat? Obviously, it was the threat of a good example, by making it contagious, doing the things that we just mentioned earlier. So they blockaded the oil, they froze the accounts, they confiscated their property in the United States, they blockaded the sale of gold, they blockaded the importing of food, they blockaded everything, absolutely everything. But if one is going to go by their allegations, the United States allegations, the only thing they didn't seem to have blockaded is cocaine, because they accused the government of Venezuela to continue shipping tons and tons of drugs when everything else is blocked. Venezuela has been expelled from the world financial market. If Venezuela were to try to buy something, purchase something in the world market, and it will pay a bank, an ordinary bank, to actually pay that bill, then the bank will not only not carry out the transaction, it will retain the money.
Could they use some of the gold that is held in the British
31
here?
tons of gold, which are illegally retained, because the government of the UK at the time said, well, we're not sure who is the government, Juan Guaido or Nicolas Maduro. And, this is the thing. So Venezuela has been applied 1,050 sanctions so far, which is huge, and literally everything. And, if you are the government of Venezuela and you appoint somebody to be in charge of a minister of health, minister of education, and if that minister wanted to sign something internationally with a collaboration with somebody else, and the government of the United States applies sanctions on that individual, then many governments will not allow that signature to take place, because, they will be threatened by the United States. And if any country, and this is the characteristic of the United States, is not only the sanctions that it itself applies to countries, but it actually acts extraterritorially. That is to say, the United States applies also secondary sanctions. That is to say, if a third country were to negotiate or engage in transaction with either Cuba or Venezuela or any country which is under that regime by the United States, the third party will be also sanctioned massively. Several companies in the United Kingdom have been massively fined by billions of dollars by the United States because they engage in transactions and deals with Cuba. And the British government is not prepared to defend national sovereignty and to defend the right of those companies to actually conduct companies when the United States has no jurisdiction whatsoever in anything the UK does with Cuba, but it does. So when they apply this, it's very serious. Nevertheless, what is interesting here is that President Maduro, who actually had, led the brunt of the sanctions, as a president, was very difficult. He managed to defeat them completely, totally. Venezuela used to import 70% of the food that it consumed. Now it produces 97% of the food that it consumes domestically. Venezuela has expanded the basket of things that it exports. The oil revenue represents only 30% of the budget. Before it was 80%, now it's 30%. Still important, but much less significant. Huge changes have taken place in Venezuela. Venezuela this year is going to grow at 7 to 9%, according to the international organizations. 7 to 9% is gigantic. So Venezuela has defeated it. So this is an additional incentive for the United States to actually attack Venezuela, because a good example is something that is contagious. You're muted.
I'm talking to myself, sorry. We've got two hands up. We've got Stephen and then Joseph. And then, all right, and the third hand has come up. We've got Roberta Kilkenny. Kilkenny, yes, that's a more familiar word. Thank you. Okay, Stephen, we'll take them in order. Stephen, you want to put your question?
Yes, thanks again. Are you hearing me? Because doesn't
Yes,
seem as though.
yes,
Okay.
loud and clear, yes.
It's a good thing to talk about the oil, but I'd really like to hear what you have to say about Peru having like vast gold reserves, silver, platinum, Colombia with emeralds, and also with platinum. Bolivia is one of the top 10 producers of silver. Brazil with diamonds, topaz, aquamarines. I mean, when you look at all of the resources that the South American continent has to offer, and I'm not even going to get into other rare earths, can you talk about if they continue to be controlled not by the people who are born on the continent, but from outsiders who continue to exploit all these resources, how that contributes to the disempowerment, both politically and financially, of the people of South America? Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Francisco,
I will take three, I think.
Yes, okay, I was just going to suggest. Okay, Stephen, can you come in with your question?
You mean me? You mean Joseph?
You mean
sorry,
Joseph?
Joseph.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I should have thanked Francisco for his brilliant presentation. I'm always happy to listen to you. In terms of some of the strategies the United States is employing or deploying against Venezuela, I heard from one of those people, podcaster, one of those who experts, that the recent pardoning of this person, I think of either Chinese guys of Chinese descent, to do with the crypto, some kind of crime, is to help. Is one of the steps towards ensuring that the advantage that Venezuela has secured in terms of maneuvering the sanctions will be closed or blocked. Can you speak to that? And if I should take the opportunity in terms of Paul said, because I may not have, in terms of CARICOM must have a lot of voice when it comes to, I was suppose you were talking about climate change, you were saying global warming, but that we need as a people to really have to wake up our government, because the kind of storm that hit, hurricane that hit Jamaica is going to come more and more, as in the Philippines, where about 2 years ago or so, or 3 years ago, the Philippines got 6 major cyclone back to back in 1 year. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Francisco, I would like to suggest if you take those two, we've got 2 more hands up. I think in terms of time management, that's about probably, and I think Simon Hines' hand is up as well. So
Yeah.
we'll try and manage those questions within the 15 minutes or so we've got. Thanks.
You know, no, I'm delighted with, you know, the more questions, the better it is. It's fantastic dialogue. I'm really enjoying it. There was first an oligarchy that, you know, took power from independence. In the case of most of the Latin American countries, with the exception of Brazil, there was a war of liberation that took place. The war of liberation lasted about 30 years. So our oligarchy was a sort of revolutionary and patriotic at some point in the past. And that's where Simon Bolivar fits in. But very soon, and the exception was Brazil, that rather than going for a war of liberation, they had to go for a compromise with Portugal, the motherland, you know, colonial power. And they did a sort of little coup d'etat, and they declared themselves an empire, which, you know, not a republic. A republic came later. So Brazil maintained most of the traditional structure of the colonial period by the same oligarchy that became, you know, part of an independent country. Whereas in the other cases, there was a promise of democracy because all the constitutions that came up in the 19th century were democratic. But, you know, the oligarchy behaved as an oligarchy, and the consequence of that was that they expropriated the indigenous people of land, they expropriated the resources and so on, and they sold themselves out, you know, to imperialism very quickly because they couldn't satisfy the increasing needs of the population. And they wanted to ensure that they buttressed their power by this might of imperialism. First it was Spain, then Britain, and then the United States. And that's what they did. So the result was being a very unequal society full of contradictions. The contradictions in Latin America are so intense and so dramatic and so deep that, you know, Latin America produces more revolutions than many other places. That is the reason. You know, you blink and then somebody produces a revolution in Latin America, which you didn't suspect it. Our path towards justice has been revolutionary. Not that we wanted to, but there is no other way. So the reason why I'm saying this is because our societies are extremely unequal. And anything, you know, that Stephen mentioned, you know, why this is in the hands of somebody else rather than the people that should have them, such as in places such as Venezuela or Cuba and so on, is because the oligarchies sell the countries down the river. They are, you know, vende patrias, as we say, you know, comprador bourgeoisie. They always make compromises with the United States and whoever is powerful. Just to give you an idea how bad it can be, before Lula came to power in Brazil, which is a good example to use, Brazil had an income distribution that was less equal than the one in South Africa under apartheid. That gives you an idea of, you know, how bad it is. When neoliberalism was applied from 1973 after Chile all the way to the 80s and 90s, the level of poverty in Latin America were in some places 85%, 82%, 77%, 60%, and so on. And these are, you know, macroeconomic measures. But if you look at the details, it was much worse. And you have people that ate sometimes, and you people that did not eat all the time. And one of the commitments of Lula was to ensure that everybody was able to eat 3 times a day. Imagine, this is a very simple, you know, a basic reform, basic proposal, basic commitment, and he managed to do it. You know, under Lula, between 2002 and all the way to 2016, when Dilma Rousseff, the president that followed, was impeached, Brazil took something like 40 million people out of poverty. So that's what it is. And, you know, all these riches, which are huge, not only land, not only water, not only minerals, not only everything. We have everything in large quantities. And we need to ensure that, you know, they stop being controlled by multinational companies. There are all sorts of strategies that people and countries can apply. So that is the reason. And when it comes to the question of what is the US strategy? Let me put it in a more global sense. The United States economy is declining really badly. It's in decadence. It's rotting away. You know, I don't want to exaggerate, but this is really serious. The debt of the United States has gone up to 38 trillion. This GDP is 30 trillion. So this is an example I always use. If the United States were to use everything it produces in 1 year, which is huge, the biggest in the world, to pay its debt, it will still owe $8 trillion, which is nearly double the combined GDP of all the Latin American countries. That gives you an idea how bad it is. And there is no way they're going to be able to pay. So what Trump is trying to do, you know, in a sort of brutal manner, is trying to resolve that problem by, on the one hand, you know, applying massive austerity, and then reaching out, because he's losing internationally, reaching out, latching out to try to reach as much as possible with all sorts of dirty deals, such as the one in Argentina, such as the one he's trying to do in Ecuador, and everything that is possible in order to improve even a little bit the position of the United States, which got a different dimension, which is more important than the economic one. The United States knows that it's not the supremo anymore. And it knows that it's losing the battle internationally with China and his allies in the world with what we call multipolarity. And he's losing, he's really losing and losing and losing. No matter how much he threatens, it doesn't work anyway. And the tariff that he's applying is just harming the US economy. It's causing damage somewhere else, but it's harming mainly the US economy. So they have drawn the conclusion, the oligarchy in the United States have drawn the conclusion, and Trump is the worst expression of the same problem or the same strategy, which is they want to ensure that they maintain #1 position as supremo by military means, because they cannot do it by political means and they cannot do it by economic means. And that's where Venezuela fits in. That's where the Caribbean fits in. That's where everything fits in. And, you know, he himself, Trump, is enriching himself massively. I mean, he's really, I cannot believe. If you follow US politics every day, you can see that he's really getting money. Billions. We're not talking about billions, billions of dollars. He's behaving in a traditional Central American, I don't want to use Caribbean, Central American dictator, you know, that uses the country to enrich themselves with everything else. So that's the problem. And I think we're going to have this phase for as long as he's around and somebody like him is around. We're going to have to face US aggression, because the only thing they know what they know to do. They don't know anything better. They resort to the same thing. These are habits which are hard to die.
Okay, thank you there for that one, Francisco. I got a challenge for you because we've got 3 hands up and you got 10 minutes. So I'll see how you'll do.
All right.
Roberta?
Always up for a challenge.
My remarks are really directed towards CLS. So if you could forgive me a moment, compañero Francisco, my remarks are not directed to you specifically.
No problem.
I think CLS as a progressive organization with a pan-Caribbean focus has a special role to play with respect to Jamaica and Guyana in connection with what is happening with Venezuela. By which I mean, if we take Jamaica first, and I appreciate the importance of US assistance to Jamaica. However, within the United States, it takes weeks, sometimes months, for the United States to send similar aid to disaster areas within the United States. So I suspect there's an ulterior motive for why the United States sent a team in 1 day to Jamaica. And I think we need to keep our eyes open for the possibility that they would be pressuring the Jamaican government to allow for an increased US military presence in Jamaica, given the current situation with respect to Venezuela. Also, with respect to Guyana, many Guyanese people, among them progressive Guyanese, are very sensitive to the idea, rightly or wrongly, that Venezuela wants to claim half of the territory of Guyana, the Essequibo region. And I think CLS has an important role to play in enlightening Guyanese as well as non-Guyanese about how vulnerable Guyana is to U.S. manipulation. There are recent U.S. agreements, military agreements, that Compañero Francisco referred to between the Guyana government and Venezuela. And I wanted to point out that those agreements do not, I'm sorry, between the Guyana government and the United States, military agreements. I wanted to point out that those agreements allow for U.S. An upgrade of U.S. military activity in Guyana, not only in the face of what they claim is the possibility of Venezuelan invasion, but also it allows for increase in military presence under the guise of the narco traffic, right, and other criminal activities. So that's also a very dangerous area. And I look forward to CLS in the coming weeks and months continuing to explore this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberta. I can assure you we won't fall asleep at the wheel. Even if I fall asleep, we've got a really great executive committee who will make sure that, you know, we're quite aware of all the issues. You know, we're very unhappy really with Jamaica in the way the delegation of the UN conference, and when they try to criticize the Israeli government for genocide, they were one of the countries that remained to listen to the lies of Netanyahu. We think that's very disgusting and a betrayal of our region and the people's aspirations for Gaza. Before I get the next two questions, I want to do a shout out for our gatekeeper who's kept us safe this whole meeting. Thanks you very much, Steve, for hanging in there and keeping us safe. Good job. Okay, we've got Simon Hines, and then Hans disappeared. Have you left us, Frank? I saw Frank's hand earlier. Frank, are you still there?
Most of the question that I wanted to ask has been covered by the last speaker. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Simon, if you put your question, and I think if I can say to you, Francisco, that there was a question up about what's happening with, if you're aware of the situation with Nigeria and the Americans threatening them with some action because of something to do with religion down there.
Yeah.
I don't know how much you've got any information. So Simon, please, your question.
Yeah, just to follow on from what Francisco was saying about America's global situation and the weakened state. And I fear that Venezuela is the first stage of an attempt by the US, not just Trump, but the US, to turn the Caribbean and Latin America into vassal states. Now, is there anything that has come out in terms of discussions amongst US elites, the State Department or sort of policy establishment that indicates that might be what the US wants to do?
And thanks for your question there, Simon.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Very quick, on Nigeria, I think, we should monitor the situation. He does these things, Donald. He just throws things around, and then the next day he does something else. We'll see. He behaves like a head of a mafioso operation. I mean, he's a fascist as well, but he's threatening all the time. And if he can punish, he does. So I suppose anybody who gets on the wrong side of it, he threatens, including people in his own party, such as John Bolton, who has now been indicted, and a few others and so on, which I don't have time to go into. But if you read the report of the Southern Command to the Senate Armed Forces Committee, which takes place regularly, where the Commander-in-Chief of the Southern Command actually reports to what they're doing, that it is totally clear in there that exactly what you're saying is already in there. They believe that there are these left-wing, sometimes they characterize as terrorist governments, such as Venezuela and a few others, narco-trafficking, or whatever adjective they want to use, who actually are allowing China and Russia to come into the continent, into the hemisphere, which is something they really resent. And they are determined to ensure that they are not there. And the way to do it is not so much by, attacking China and Russia militarily directly, although there is something of that all the time. But the intention from this report is to say we should make sure that those governments are unable to do what they're doing by inviting China and Russia to participate in their development. Because these are resources that we actually, the United States said, we want. And it's interesting, they used to call the hemisphere the backyard. Now in those documents, they refer to the hemisphere as our vicinity, our neighborhood, which is quite funny. So in there you see there is a military dimension of what Trump and others are trying to do. Every time a Democrat or a Republican tries to overthrow a government, they're trying to ensure that only they control this. And I think by now the situation is desperate. And that's why they're lashing out. And Venezuela, if they can get away with Venezuela, can you imagine what they would do? Not only there will be killings all over the place, there will be thousands of people dead. Summary executions all over the place. They would use Venezuela as a platform to attack Cuba immediately. And then Nicaragua will be next and further down the food chain. So therefore, one of the things which I wasn't able to answer to the question by Joseph Antoine, which is the best way to defend the sovereignty of our nations, including the Caribbean in particular, is through collective effort, collective action. The more united we are as a collective, as we were a few years ago, the easier it is to defend it. The easier it is to actually deploy resources, the easier it is to politically isolate and denounce any attack. And that is the question. I think the United States is going to fail in their attempts because what they offer compared to, say, multipolarity, particularly from China, they got market, technology, credit, and investment. And what you get from the United States, austerity, pillage, and military bases. They're not very attractive. So that's why he's going to lose. And they're wrecking economies all over the place. Wherever they intervene, they wreck them. So not only we need to defend the nation, but also we need to do it collectively. Only by collectively doing it, we're going to be able to do it, which was Chavez's idea of regional integration. So we remain totally optimistic because battles are always in place. We have been battling since 1492 in the case of our continent, and we are going to continue to do it. And we have advanced so far to this point where we can actually see the possibility, the light at the end of the tunnel of a much better world, which is multipolar. And that's what we are aiming for. We're not alone, but the battle now is difficult, and we need to be united in these citadels of imperialism, such as here, to ensure that our voices are heard, to make sure that our governments, do not participate as accomplices in this horrible operation that Trump is trying to organize against Venezuela. I leave it there.
Thank you. I think we'll take those as your final words, Francisco. They're pretty amazing, and thanks for really full and thorough 2 hours of your time. I think it was pretty amazing. You're becoming more and more like Fidel Castro. I'll keep my eye on you there. But
That's a
And-
very
and-
generous
and-
comparison.
and maybe I don't our banners are beginning to affect them. We're nobody's backyard. I don't think the Americans will see us putting up we're nobody's vicinity anytime soon. It's going to be no backyard. We'll remind them of their arrogance and how they treat us in the Caribbean. We will not be retreating. We will keep fighting, and we will keep taking our action. As I often like to say to people, we're an activist organization, and we like to get out there to make sure our voices are heard and the Caribbean perspective is heard out there. All that's left
Can I just thank Caribbean Solidarity?
The thanks is coming entirely from us.
It's been such engaging, interesting conversation, where you really understand what questions to ask. That's exactly the right questions. That's exactly the right issues. So I'm delighted to be with people who have such a high political level. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Francisco. And of course, for many of us, one of my first political activities in this country was when they attacked the El Salvador. And that was one of the first times I campaigned against the American embassy. And that continues. So Latin America has been through a lot, holds out a lot to all of us. And there's a lot we can learn from the revolutions and the activities that's happened down there. We're in the Caribbean, we've remained a zone of peace, and we will try and keep it that way. That's something to fight for. And I need to thank everyone who's come on this meeting. Without you, our meetings are nothing. You're the most important part of this meeting. We encourage you to bring more friends onto our meetings, and especially the time when people are being coerced and frightened into being silent and to not take action. Now is the time we have to really be fighting back. One of the biggest dangers we're facing at the moment is, as Caribbean people and diaspora in Britain, is the rise of fascism. And we know that's being manufactured in the United States mainly. We saw the way Trump behaves. He's rightly, an outright racist. One of his right-hand men, we saw Musk doing the Nazi salute on television, and they're funding the likes of Tommy Robinson in this country, who are determined to make lives really unpleasant for Black people in the UK. So we've got to organize as a people and stay united and fight. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a really, really great thing. Your questions, everyone, the questions. Steve, for being a good guard on the outside there. None of those racist attacks this time with pornography on our site. We will keep them at bay. Hopefully they will learn sense too. So at that point, I'd say thank you all for attending. We can leave the meeting. Thank you very much, Francisco.
Thank
again.
you. Thank
Million.
you. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a nice rest of the weekend. Take
You
care.
too.